the reason that we're all here, which is to spend an evening with, learn from, and bask in the true eloquence of Hugh Johnson OBE. For those of you who don't know Hugh well, then I hope that you are prepared for an evening of true tale telling. And for those of you who do know Hugh, well, you already know what to expect. Hugh's influence in the world of wine cannot be understated. Somewhat like ivy working its way around a tree, Hugh has zigged and zagged around the subject, writing some of the greatest books on wine of all time, including the recently republished Story of Wine, which we're going to get onto a little bit later. But he's also been involved in TV series as a director at a famous Bordeaux Chateau, and also heavily involved in the Royal Tokaji Company. Again, all subjects I hope that we'll cover this evening. So it really is all encompassing. So Hugh, on behalf of all members at the Wine Society, I would like to raise a glass to welcome and thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, I'll join you in that. Lovely to meet everybody.
It's our pleasure. It really is, Hugh. Thank you. And what have you got in your glass tonight?
I am drinking Bride Valley, which is the late, sadly late Stephen Spurrier, a great friend of mine who died the other day. I'm drinking this because it's lovely and partly in his memory. And it's his Dorset bubbly. It's very special.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hugh. And we've got some questions up our sleeve a little later about English wine, but I think a worthy tribute tonight. And I do hope some other members have got a bottle of Stephen Spurrier's wine open tonight to toast to him. I thought, Hugh, first we would talk a little bit about your writing, which has arguably been your biggest contribution to the world of wine. But first, I hope you don't mind, and members, you'll have to indulge me for just a moment. I asked some much wiser colleagues of mine who've been in the trade much longer than me to share their impressions and experiences of Hugh and his work. And firstly, our head of buying, Pierre Mansour, said that Hugh's book, The World Atlas of Wine, which I actually have a copy of here, was the reason that he got into the wine trade, which is no small declaration in itself.
Interrupt you for a moment, Anna.
Yes.
You've got a very, very old edition of the World Atlas of Wine.
Haven't I just? I know. It was actually my father's. So I think I need updating.
Oh my goodness, we're on edition number 8 now. So it's a bit...
Well, I think not only do I need a new pocketbook of wine, I need a new World Atlas. So Christmas lists galore coming my way now. But I want to share with you, Hugh, a quick story, very, very short, but Marcel Orford-Williams, who members may know as our buyer for Germany and the Rhone, amongst other regions, replied to my request saying, and his exact words were, "He is my inspiration for writing tasting notes, as his are the best." And then to compound that statement, about 20 minutes later, I got an email from Sebastian Payne, MW, who said, "A wordsmith extraordinary who can bring the taste and smell of a wine to life with just a couple of well-chosen words which capture them both. We wine buyers know how difficult it is to describe a wine in a good tasting note, and Hugh is the master at doing that without an equal, in my view. Only Andrew Jefford comes close, and sometimes Marcel." So there you go. Your words on wine have touched several members of the wine buying team at the Wine Society, and not least Marcel Orford-Williams, who styles all of his wine notes on you. So Hugh, what is it, do you think, about your tasting notes and about your writing style that makes them so accessible to people?
Well, you warned me about this question, Anna, so I've had a little think about it, and I can't answer it. I have to say that I'm a writer first and a wine expert later. I mean, I also write about trees, about gardening, about whatever. So words are my medium, and I love them, and I read a lot, and I'm inspired even by Shakespeare, who used to make up words. That's not a bad idea either. But choosing the words, I think I see wine holistically. I don't think in technical terms. about sort of the stages of tasting, although that is essential. I just words come to my head because I feel something about a wine, and that's not just about its taste. It'll be about its history. It'll be about its background. It'll be about my love or otherwise for where it comes from, even for the people who make it. So it's a sort of holistic approach, and that's why words, which are not standard tasting terms, do come to me from somewhere.
Do you think you started off we actually have very interestingly a similar start in our careers, Hugh. My first job out of university was also at Condé Nast.
No, really?
Yes, it was. I did English at university, not at Cambridge like yourself, but I did English at university as well. And then I went into Condé Nast to work for World of Interiors magazine.
Well, bad luck.
Bad luck. But you did start and had a very successful career in magazines prior to writing books. And do you think that sort of casual editorial style has helped, that you think about perhaps the reader first and then the wine after?
I mean, I think I write to the reader just as I was writing them a letter. And magazines certainly helped because after I started on Vogue, and 10 years later I was the travel editor of the Sunday Times for a while under Harry Evans, the editor. And then I was editor of Queen, which is now gone, but it became Harper's and Queen. It was fashion and gossip and a bit tattlery, but we tried to cover a lot of things. And I realized that you grab readers through short bits of captions. I mean, captions are terribly important in a book. When people open a book or a magazine, first they look at the pictures. Well, they can't help that. Then they look, what is this picture about? They look at the caption. And so crunching information into very few words is absolutely in my DNA. My pocket wine book started with, well, the entries in it were shorter than the original tweets, which were 140 characters. And I will use abbreviations. I'll use anything to get the point across quickly. And the best thing is the choice of a word.
Well, actually, that does remind me, Hugh, I devoured the new republication of The Story of Wine at the weekend. And there was a quote actually that reminded me a little, I'm sorry, I'm going slightly off topic, but I think it does sum up a little bit what you're saying. And I'd love it if you could expand on it slightly. You were talking about in this section of the book, Andre Simon and his a particular sort of early 20th century writing. And he said, the essential unpretentiousness that made Simon the ideal interpreter of wine to the world is summed up in his modest definition of a connoisseur, one who knows good wine from bad and is able to appreciate the different merits of different wines. And then you comment, many who have gone further have said too much. I really loved that. I think often there can be a bit of a tendency to overcomplicate wine, and your writing certainly doesn't do that.
Well, you know, we come to the sort of complications that are come on back labels. I think back labels, in a way, are a great enemy of the life of wine, because you know, who really cares whether it's 56 or 57% Merlot? You know, this is to most people who love wine and enjoy it and have judgment about it as well. You just say, well, that's for the birds. You know, it's not the story I want.
Absolutely. And famously, you're a bit adverse to putting numbers on points for wine as well. So
wait a minute, a bit averse.
Just a touch.
I think it's a disaster. And Robert Parker and I have been at loggerheads on this for so many years. I mean, went on and on and on. I remember the first time I met the Parker points because we shared an editor at a publisher's in New York, and he showed me this document with very, very good tasting notes full of life and imagination. And then next to them were numbers. And I said, what are these numbers? They're not the vintages. I mean, we haven't reached 98 years. It's just 20 years ago. Oh, he said that they're the scores. And I said, you can't score wine. Would you score your friends? I mean, wine's my friends. I'm not giving them scores.
Very understandable. I think as wine communicators from the tastings team, we often struggle with that ourselves, that sometimes people want things to be put into a box and how many points did that get, or what is the percentage of this, or how many years in oak, and it can be challenging to communicate a wine in numbers and stats. It doesn't really feel right somehow. Do you think there's any alternatives? You've spoken about talking briefly in captions, but for example, do you think things like these video sessions or the rise of social media has lent itself to wine communication in a word-friendly way?
Blogs very much do, don't they? But the great master, the great tasting master was Michael Broadbent. And he expressed his opinion very clearly and brilliantly, above all in his vintage wine book, which is a masterpiece. And he managed to score wines out of 5 stars, if you like. He never went beyond 5, but he made you realize when 5 was not quite enough. And that told you really, whatever your taste scoring system, whether it's out of 5 or out of 20 or out of 100, which actually is out of 50 because the 100-point system starts with 50, you come back to the same thing. You're in a very narrow bracket. You look at, I mean, my dear friend Jancis, in her wonderful website, jancisrobertson.com, she uses a 20-point score. And if you follow those points, wines that are fine and worth considering and talking about, which she's enjoying, wines of character, they all bunch up between about 16 and 17. It's extraordinary. When you get into the fine distinctions, there aren't great differences, and you hesitate and you think, well, I think it's a matter of preference, really. These wines are equally good, in my opinion, and technically good. They show the character of where they come from. They are going to keep well or improve. Right, so they're 16-ish, 17-ish. How do you decide which of those you want to give it? It's the one you like better. So in the end, it's quite subjective.
Absolutely. And even a member has commented, Susan McCrum, and I apologize if I've mispronounced that, Susan, but she's also commented, do points not also reflect the taste of the writer?
They certainly do.
So yes, what sounds like a subjective system of numbers actually, objective, is not actually at all. You're following another person's palate.
Yeah, we're all human.
Wonderful, Hugh. Thank you. It's also music to my ears, as I struggle with following the numbers myself, but I've never been a numbers person, and I suppose that's just all of our different brains, isn't it? But it doesn't suit me, that's for sure. Hugh, I would love to talk a little bit not only about the Wine Society, but about some wines that you recently picked. But before we go on to some Wine Society wines that you have highlighted, shall we say, for good wines to taste this year, sort of as a wine lover yourself, I don't suppose you have any stories or recollections of the Wine Society?
Oh, well, yes. I'm one of the Society's biggest fans. I'm not just saying that because it's you, but I inherited my membership from an uncle, and it dates back, believe it or not, to something before the First World War, I think. I mean, he was an elderly uncle, and I'm elderly myself, so it's not that surprising. But when I tell somebody on the telephone, they say, what's your number? And I say, it's 4,177. And they say, really? I said, there's a digit missing there. Surely. I said, no, it's a very early one. And I've used it, a very great deal, and I still do. I mean, I'm always looking at the list, and the Nigel, the driver, is always turning up at my door. Um, so, frankly, I love the Wine Society. It just suits me down to the ground.
Wonderful. And actually, yes, so I was scurrying through some recent interviews you have done, Hugh, and one was with the buyer, I think, in September, and they asked you for a list of wines that you would recommend to drink. Don't worry, I will remind you what they were. You're not expected to recall all 10. But there are a few of the wines on that list that we actually do sell and work with. And I've picked 4 in particular because I think there's probably some nice stories to be had behind all 4 of them. I should warn members in advance that all 4 of these wines are not currently for sale, but I'll tell you when they will be afterwards. But they're wines that we do stock. So the first wine on the list, and whether you could provide a little perhaps insight into your feelings behind it, is the Gearsville Ridge vineyards from Sonoma County, California.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your feelings about that wine, Hugh.
Well, yes, it stands out among California Cabernets like a, I was going to say, like a good deed in a naughty world. I was a very, very early enthusiast for California, and loved and remember very well early Napa Cabernets. There were more, I could say, claret-like, really. And then along came, you can blame Robert Parker, you can blame global warming. They got sweeter, riper, thicker, to the point where you couldn't finish a bottle. You could barely finish a glass. In my case, somebody said, so I think it was a Frenchman who said, this wine, great big thick red. He said, this is food, drink, and a good cigar. I didn't actually want a cigar in my glass. So I was turned off the current trendy style of California cabs, especially the Napa ones, that have reached incredible prices because they're cults. And, you know, a cult is not good for wine drinkers. It's for collectors. And, you know, are collectors drinkers? That's another question. But we go back to Ridge, Montebello, which is quite divorced from anything like the Napa Valley. From the vineyard, the high vineyard at Montebello, you look down on Silicon Valley. You know, that's Google down there, and that's Apple or whatever it is. And you also look down the other side into the trench of the San Andreas Fault, which is the fault that caused the great San Francisco earthquake and probably will do again one day. And so it's a great cleft in the ground. So you've got the earthquakes on one side, you've got Keene Valley, you've got Silicon Valley down there, and you're in a sublime vineyard, and it's sort of it's rather moving. You know, wine is above all this, and this particular place makes the best Cabernet in California.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, we're big fans of Ridge at the tastings team too. We had Eric on for one of our earlier events actually last year when we first went virtual. So we had a lovely time with Eric.
Well, I should mention Paul Draper because it's all due to Paul Draper, who's now retired or retiring, but it was he who created it.
Absolutely. And for members, we don't actually have the Cabernet for sale at the moment. As you can imagine, it sells unbelievably quickly, but we have got some of their East Bench Zinfandel for sale. So,
oh yes, the Zins are just magic too.
Yeah, they sell equally as fast. I should warn you. We just get a bit more of them. I think that's the thing. Now, the second wine I'd love you to tell us a little bit about and your experience of, Hugh, is from Schloss Gerbelsberg. And it's actually the Grüne Veltliner rather than the Riesling. Again, we had Michael Musbrugger on recently. He did a fantastic event for our members. But Grüne, sort of 2-3 years ago, was not really on many people's radars. So when would your love affair with Grüne begin?
Not a very long time ago. I mean, for several reasons. One, because they make it much better than they used to. Two, because I've visited Vienna more, which is basically where it comes from. it's the local wine of Vienna, and it can be just a very casual but spicy, tasty white, and that's the kind of thing you drink in the Heurigen, the open air wine bars that seem to be springing up in London these days too. Um, it I don't look for any special qualities, just sheer enjoyment, and that is really the most important thing.
I would agree. And I think certainly our team as well find Gruner a very good catch-all for food.
Oh, it's a perfect food wine.
So the next wine, Hugh, don't worry, I've only got two more. But for members, we sell the Schloss Gerbelsberg wines on Premier, so they have already all sold out. But watch out for next year because they are really impeccable wines. The next wine, now you're going to have to excuse my pronunciation, but it's a wine from Crete, the Daphne. And the vineyard is the Pessarades vineyard. Terrible pronunciation, by Domaine Lyrarakis. Again, Hugh, Greece seems to be just on an unstoppable path at the moment, wine-wise.
Quite right. It's amazing that it was hidden from us for so long, really. I mean, in all my career of knowing wine, Greek wine was not up to scratch. Everyone joked about Retsina. Retsina can be drinkable, but it can't be great. And these remarkable grape varieties with long histories were unknown, unpronounceable, and not studied and chosen by our wine trade. So we depend on wine merchants to bring us the good wines of the world. Not everybody can go out to Greece and taste all the wines and say, found one I like. You depend on a professional taster to sort out the good from the not so good. And some have really scored recently. I mean, I think the one that's made the biggest reputation fastest is from the amazing volcanic island of Santorini. And that is uh, um, a very dry, but sparkly, not sparkly, I mean sparky, I would say. Wine.
Sparky, great word, fantastic word.
Wine. And I went there when I was making a film series on the history of wine. I didn't know anything about Santorini except it has its place in history because it made sweet wine for the Russian Orthodox Church. And when all the Greek islands were taken over by the Turks, by the Ottoman Empire, they pretty much, as you can imagine, Muslims did away with wine, but they couldn't afford to do away with Santorini's sweet wine because the Russians were couldn't get enough of it, and the Sublime Port, which was the name of the court in Constantinople, taxed the devil out of it. So they were making a big fortune out of this. Somebody else's religion.
I think, is it Creto, the particular variety you're talking about, Hugh, the white wines of Santorini, the most famous?
Yeah.
Yes, so we do have some of those as well, members, don't worry. But again, those sell fantastically fast now. They're really they're fine wines by anyone's standard, really.
Very fine. With a lot of firepower. They hit quite hard. It's not a question of alcoholic strength, it's character. And you can't not notice them. You can't just swill them.
Absolutely, not wimpy wines. And that the wine we started talking about initially, the Crete wine, the Daphne, will be on sale next month to our members, which is great. And then I wanted to finish, we mentioned earlier, we mentioned the wines of England, and obviously you have Stephen Spurrier's wine in your glass this evening, but I know that you're equally as fond of Breaky Bottom, and the Cuvée Reynolds Stone Brut was in your list. So I suppose if you could tell us a little bit about your feelings on that wine, and then in particular how you feel about English wine. I'm sure you've been asked plenty of times, but it's always on the agenda for our members.
Well, it's one of the most exciting things that's happened in my half century of wine life, honestly. is the rise of English wine. And I was recounting to somebody recently, the first time I met it, it was down at Hambledon, famous for its cricket pitch in the 18th century cricket. And the old Marshal of the Diplomatic Corps, a very grand gentleman called Major General Sir Guy Salisbury Jones, had a feeling that he could ripen grapes in Hampshire. Nobody else agreed, but he did. And I went to see him when I was very young and he was very old, and we tasted his wine. And that was my first experience of English wine, a bit doubtful. Since then, everything has changed, and I've watched it changing. And well, Breaky Bottom is one of the pioneers in quality. I don't really understand why that cuvee Reynolds Stone was called after. I knew Reynolds Stone. He was an artist who lived in Dorset. I've got one of his watercolors of his wild garden. He lived in the same village as Stephen and Bella Spurrier, right opposites, in fact. And somehow his name ought to be attached to something from Dorset, I think. But it's a lovely wine, and it's one of it's a pioneer English wine. Now I could name you 20 that I would think were absolutely on a par with everything except the very best champagne. And even then, if they're different from champagne, they're on a par in quality terms, in enjoyment terms, have a different flavor because they're English.
You've actually, I may be misquoting you a little, but I have read somewhere that you drink as much sparkling now as you do English sparkling as you do French sparkling.
Well, actually more.
More, now, there we go.
Because there's so much to explore, Anna. You know, you don't just home in on your Roger or whatever your favorite is. You think, gosh, I have to try this one, I have to try that one.
Lovely. And Hugh, we had Peter on recently for Breaky Bottom, and he told us that the reason that Reynolds Stone is on that label is he actually designed the artwork. He designed the original Breaky Bottom logo, and so it's a sort of salute to him. So there we go. I like it when we've got enough knowledge to share around. I think that's probably the only thing I will ever tell Hugh Johnson OBE. Lovely, Hugh.
The label is not always a good reason to buy the wine.
Absolutely. So we've talked about English wine. I'd like to flip across the globe if it's possible, because I'd like to delve a little into your history with the Royal Tokaji Company. For any members that don't know, I'm sure they'd love to hear the story. And I also did a bit of digging today, and last year we sold almost 1,300 bottles of Royal Tokaji. So we have plenty of fans, I'm sure, in the audience who would love to hear about your involvement.
Well, in the old days, I mean very old days, Berry Brothers were the only people who imported Tokaji at all, and it was a kind of a legend. Have you ever tasted Tokaji? It wasn't available, and in fact, the best tasting note I think I've ever read in my life was when a famous Oxford Don wrote, "I've just tasted an Imperial Tokaji, and it is so different from every other wine that it was like seeing a new primary color." Now try to imagine that. So I mean, Tokaji is different, and it was highly prized. It was a legend, and then it was completely wrecked, of course, like everything else in Eastern Europe, by the communists. It was about the most expensive wine in the world, let's say at the turn of the 19th century. Everything that happened around the time of the First World War put an end to it. The Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks, the First World War, the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all these things happened at the same time, and this was the market for Tokaji. I mean, England was tiny, tiny bit. It was the Russians, the Poles, the Austro-Hungarians who drank it. And the market disappeared. The Soviets took over, and they had I think young people now simply haven't experienced, they've got no idea of how awful communism was, how ghastly life was for people in the Soviet bloc. When I first went to Budapest in just before the 1989 collapse of communism, I could not believe that this great city, magnificent city, was still full of shell holes and bullet scars, and the great buildings had not seen a pot of paint. I used to say the whole thing was lit with one 40-watt bulb. That was the impression it gave. Communism was a complete catastrophe. People did not know what they were missing even. Anyway, when communism came to an end, I could see that coming. I had tasted old Tokai. I could see that the only great vineyard of history that was stuck behind the Iron Curtain was Tokai. And with a great friend of mine, Peter Vending-Diers, a very, very fine winemaker from Denmark, he is a historian as well. And we said, we got to do something about this because the place is there, the vines are there, the climate is there, the soil is there, the people are there. We'd better get cracking and try to revive this wonderful wine. So we went. The revolution happened in about November 1989. By January 1990, we were there on the spot, looking for anyone who made good wine. And we started the Royal Tokaji Wine Company there and then. And it doesn't belong to us, and it hasn't done for a long time. It belongs to the grandson of a friend of my grandfather. It's a funny thing. But it makes this extraordinary wine, and we led the way. We gave hope to the winemakers of this region that had been comprehensively wrecked. The communists had planted vineyards in the wrong place, they watered them, and so on. We set up a sort of standard and said, this is what it should be like. Top vineyards. Now, the Royal Tokaji Wine Company sells individual vineyard wine in just the same way as Burgundy. You know, Tokaji also has its Cordon Charlemagne or its Montrachet, and fabulous wines they are. They're expensive, but heavens, this is the world's greatest sweet wine. And I say that, you know, everyone says, what about Chateau? And I say, well, okay, what about Yquem? I will give you a glass of Chateau and put beside it a glass of my old vineyard, Mézes Mai, and of about the same age. And I say, you taste the two, tell me if you prefer one or the other. And I think half the people went for Yquem, half went for the totally different flavors of Tokai, which Yquem is all creamy richness, sweet, sweet, sweet. Tokai has got just as much sweetness, if not more, but it's also got balancing acidity. So the final taste in your mouth is fresh and appetizing, and you say, oh, I want another sip of that. You never tire of it. And that is its secret. And it is, to my mind, the greatest sweet wine on earth. Or can be, I say.
Thank you so much. We certainly have plenty of members who agree with you wholeheartedly, Hugh. And it's lovely to hear about your involvement, you know, right from 89 and 90. So yeah. Thank you very much. Speaking of 89, I believe that's actually when the first publication of the Story of Wine.
That's right.
Yes. So I have one quick question first, which baffled me. The amount of information in the Story of Wine, for anyone who's not read it, is incredible. But you make a point of saying it's not a history, it is a story. And I think for that reason, it's impossible to put down, because it's a narrative, it's an epic, it's a tale. And for me, I had one major question, which was, how long in man hours would you say it took you to research and write the first edition in 89?
Well, my secret was a brilliant researcher. And that happened because I set out to make a television series, which is called Vintage. Um, the television people, on the whole, don't really like wine as a subject. It's not graphic, you know. On television, one glass of wine looks exactly like another. You've got to justify being there. And Jancis did very well and had made very good interviews with people. That was the first real serious wine program. There were others. There was Julie Goulden making absurd remarks about tennis shoes, um, and I really wanted to do it. There was such a story to tell, so I realized that the way to tell it was to tell the history, how, why wines are different, where they all started, and I sold this idea to Channel 4 and public broadcasting in Boston. And I needed a budget because it was going to be terribly expensive. No English company would touch it. So I met the chap who was coining money in importing Lambrusco, sweet, fizzy Italian wine, to the States. He called it Riunite, and he made a fortune. Lovely chap called John Mariani. And I said, John, I need something like $1.5 million to make a television series. And he said, well, he said, Hugh, he said, I've made a bucket of money. I think I owe something back to wine. So yeah, you go ahead. And without that, it simply wouldn't have happened. And so we had the budget. The history almost wrote itself. What I needed was the research. And I was terribly lucky. I was introduced to a young lady called Helen Bettinson, who just graduated with a history first from Cambridge. And I said, how would you like to be my researcher? And she became absolute linchpin of the whole thing. We traveled all over to all the different locations to make a 13-part series. And she provided me with so much information that I had to pick out what was interesting for telly. And that worked fine. I had a wonderful director, Michael Gill, who made the famous Kenneth Clark Civilization series. So it was rather modeled on that, really. And we couldn't use quarter, not a tenth of all the research. So when the series was finished, I thought, wow, I haven't half got a book here. And she helped me with that too. And I've got files and files of still unused, marvelous material, which I gave. It's now at the University of California, Davis, the big wine campus of Berkeley. And they've got the wonderful wine library. I don't suppose there's a better anywhere. And I offered them this research and all the rest of my archives, really, going back a long time. So that's there. And that the sequels to that story are that Jancis has given her archives to them, and they're collecting quite a packet of paper, including enormous amount of historical information I couldn't fit in.
I'm not surprised, but also surprised at the same time. It's jam-packed to the point where I know I'll reread it over and over again and get something new every time. So it really is a delight. Obviously, a lot of the book is historical, but since its publication, a lot has changed in the world of wine, significant amounts. So since 1989 and now, what have been, in your opinion, the biggest improvements in the wine trade or industry? And also, do you think there have been any losses?
Jolly difficult question, Anna. People said to me, why don't you update this book? And 25 years later, I thought, no, it is the story. That when I came into wine, that was what gripped me, was how it all came into being. I've told the story. If I updated it, there'd be a lot of technical stuff that wouldn't really grab my audience, one thing. And also, it's awful lot of business stuff. It's all what the city calls, what do they call it, mergers and acquisitions. And frankly, I'm not interested in mergers and acquisitions, and I wouldn't make them a good story. And it doesn't really affect the wine. So I think that the story was told, and then we come to what has changed. A universal upgrade, frankly. It's the part is the generational change. You haven't got the old stagers sticking to their own formulas. You've got everybody much better educated. You've got universities going deeper and deeper into things that people never even suspected before on every aspect, from obviously from grape growing to bottling and everything else. In that regard, actually, California was really interesting because great textbooks were written up to this century, I would say, where everything was based on climate zones. It was all about temperature and everything else. They never even mentioned what Americans call the dirt. So I couldn't understand this. I said, but what's the soil here? Oh, the dirt. Not bad, So they'd failed to get the sort of terroir idea to my mind. Montebello that we've been talking about is one of the finest terroirs. And the character of wine comes from the land, the climate, the weather, and the people. I seem to be rattling on. I'm not answering your question, Anna. Right.
Rattling from you, Hugh, is an absolute delight, so we don't mind at all. I'm happy hearing about the dirt. But I suppose I would be interested to hear if you do think there have been any losses.
Losses.
Yeah. Anything that we've lost sight of, perhaps, or a development you're not so fond of in the last 30 years.
Well, I've already mentioned I'm not fond of these great muscle builders, because my judgment, I once wrote in my pocket wine book, once wrote a sort of skit on tasting. I said the minimum score is one sniff. If you simply can't take a second sniff, that's terrible. Then the next score is obviously one sip. If you are prepared to take a second sip, then it wasn't quite as bad as you first thought, and so on, up and up and up, until you feel you've actually got to buy the Chateau. It's because it's so marvelous. So all that is saying, it's a matter of how much you want to drink. Is it a one glass wine, a 2 glass wine, a 1 bottle wine, or when you finish the bottle, you say, "Oh, I must have another bottle. And there's so much, I just adore it." And that is actually a very good way of tasting wine. I've got a friend who runs a Swiss-German wine magazine, and when they get together and his tasting panel will have, let's say, 20, or a dozen or 20, let's say, Chiantis on the table, and they'll taste them. And then he'll put them on, they'll have a sort of scratch lunch, and they put all the bottles on the table. And then at the end of lunch, he'll measure how much is left in the bottles there. And the bottles where nothing is left are clearly the winners. This is, to me, it's so refreshing to have a sort of a real concrete judgment. How much do we like this? How much will we drink of it? Is it something where you taste it and say, "Oh, how wonderful," and then what's next?
I agree. To our household, the best wines are the ones that go in the recycling first. That's the way we judge them. Now, Hugh, I'm conscious lots of members have asked lots of questions, and I do apologize for members. We're not going to be able to get through too many of them, but you spoke about not updating the story of wine a moment ago, for good reason. One book that you are able to update and should update regularly is obviously your pocket guide. Very importantly, so it'd be awful if you didn't update that particular pocket wine book. Now, John Crawford has asked, how do you manage to keep abreast of all the wines that you update each year in your indispensable pocket wine book?
Well, it's clearly the it's a $64,000 question. With difficulty, with a team of about 24 friend experts all over the wine world, and with the essential organization and help of my editor, Margaret Rand. Now, Margaret is one of the rather unsung stars of the wine world. And the news that I'm prepared to break to you now, because it's no longer a secret, is that having done 44 years of the pocket wine book, the first edition was a very modest, slim thing. I've decided to turn it over to Margaret. So although it will have my name on it, because that's the brand, it will in fact not be, I won't be the overall editor. Up to now, obviously I haven't read every word. I haven't written every word. I've read every word. I've corrected things. I've doubted things. I've made, very often my contribution has been to cut out several words or to abbreviate, crunch it up. Anyway, it won't be me anymore. From next year, it'll be Margaret. And I'm breathing a sigh of relief, I must say, although I'm quite proud of having kept it up for 44 years.
It's certainly been an endeavour, Hugh. Did you imagine you were going to be doing it for 44 years when you first started?
To be quite honest, I didn't think, when my publisher, James Mitchell, came back, I thought, this is a very useful little notebook I've written. He said, and what about the new edition? And I said, no, what? He said, yes, this has got to be an annual. And I said, oh dear, has it really?
And here we are. Lovely, thank you, Hugh. Now we've got a few more member questions, so you'll have to excuse me. We may sort of travel a little in our questioning for a moment, but we have had some fantastic ones. John Kavanagh has asked, which is the area that Hugh feels is currently under the radar, which has fantastic wine at value for money and prices where we should get in quick before they go through the roof when the rest of the world catches on?
Well, there are a whole lot. It's very, very difficult to pick one. Over the last few years or few decades, in fact, we've been looking further and further abroad. I mean, I remember in the early 70s, nobody took Australian wine seriously. And I went there and got excited. And then we started to go to South America, and we were discovering or inventing new wine lands all over the world. Now, where would you go? Rather than getting all steamed up about Argentina or Uruguay, lovely wine from Uruguay, or even China, I say, well, hang on. The French know a great deal about winemaking. It's in their blood, just as they know a lot about cooking. They're very greedy and very realistic, and they make wonderful things. How about looking at France? And if I had to choose one area to be exploring, to be excited about, to be looking for value and character, I think it would be the south of France, the Midi, right across from, well, not including Provence, but going west from the Rhone Valley. Almost everything is worth exploring.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm sure Marcel will be delighted to hear that. He'll be copying your wine buying notes, maybe stealing some tips on some other areas as well. Now, I've had a question from Mr. Patel. I think I know the answer to this, Hugh, but I'm going to let you share the story because it is one that for some of you maybe have heard before, but for those who haven't, is lovely. He has asked, what was the first bottle of wine that started your wine journey? And my understanding is it wasn't a bottle, Hugh, was it?
that started my
Wine journey.
yeah. It was red Burgundy. Funnily enough, it's a strange coincidence, but my friend Jancis tells exactly the same story from her Oxford days. She had a glass of red Burgundy that blew her mind, and I was actually in my rooms when my roommate came in, not 100% sober, um, in his dinner jacket late one night, and I was pretending to work, and he gave me 2 glasses of wine, and he said, "What do you think about these?" And I hadn't really thought much about, never thought about wine tasting really before, hardly. And I said, "Well, this one is simply incredible, it's sublime, it's marvelous." And the other one, well, nothing much really, just red. And he said, "Well, isn't it amazing? They come from two vineyards within 100 meters of each other, and uh, the I'm fascinated by the fact that it comes out of the soil, more than just the soil, obviously. I mean, the winemaker." And I said, "Yeah." And in a way, that was my sort of road to Damascus moment. I mean, that's the one I remember.
Thank you so much, Hugh. It's a lovely story. And yes, I'm pleased to hear that Janice has had the same. Red Burgundy is obviously the gateway wine.
Her wine was Chambord Musigny Les Amoureuses. I think she fell for that gorgeous name. Who wouldn't love a wine called The Lovers? I mean, after all.
Absolutely. Um, we have had I've probably got a chance for a couple more questions, and then Hugh, I have to share an anecdote with you at the end. So I'll go for a couple more questions. One is, do you think that the rise of social media wine influencers, or as they're being called, wine influencers, are having a positive impact on the wine world? We touched a bit earlier on blogs, so maybe if you could expand, do you think they're doing a good job of shining light on wine and producers to a younger generation?
Well, I'm sure they do, but how much time have you got? You know, you can only follow so many bloggers, and there are thousands, I imagine. So that's one of the troubles with the internet. Where do you stop? And uh, although there tends to be a sort of consensus about exciting things, I suppose, I think this is where there's a role for the author who writes books or articles and takes responsibility and says, "This is I've researched and this is my judgment." Because I think bloggers just can, I'm not accusing them, but they can get away with just, "This is what I had last night." Um, and how do you how do you judge the judges? I could put that in Latin, but I won't bother.
Thank you. You've led me actually back to a question that I'd prepared earlier, so apologies, members. But your book is so well researched and thought through, and you must have spent plenty of mental time in all of these places. In my head, it travels across time and space. And my question to you, because it's something I started thinking about as I was reading the book, was if you could travel to any one chapter in your book, which would it be and why?
I've thought about that, and I can't really, you know, really can't answer it. I tried to picture different wine areas at different points in history, and but questions that really interested me. I mean, I was fascinated by the Greeks and their wine god Dionysus and so on. I'm not saying that the wine would have been all that great. Um, Roman banquets would have been marvelous to visit. The whole question, it was a different question, I know, but the whole question of how wine came to be banned in the name of the Prophet Muhammad um, in the Middle East, where it started, is a very worrying question. I've never got an answer to it. I have interviewed imams and all that kind of thing. They tend to dodge the question because they don't really know. It's a sort of controlling controlled freakery, perhaps in one way. Although there's an interesting story because um, the Sultan now, was he be the Sultan, the head honcho in Constantinople in the 16th century, um, he banned coffee houses. Coffee houses, he said, were um, uh, caused trouble. People went to coffee houses and got upset about the government, and they were nothing but sedition. He said, "You make the coffee houses serve wine. That'll calm them down." So there are different views, but that whole debate is not a period of time in answer to your question, but it's a very, very interesting debate. And Islam has not always banned wine; it does at the moment, and I hope it's a great hope of mine that one day the Middle East will come to its senses. They will start drinking wine. They'll calm down. They won't start half the world's wars, and that's my thinking. Um, I would love to have been in the dining rooms of Georgian England when the first real wine connoisseurs were collecting wine. Um, there were people like Lord Chandos, who had Handel as his house musician, um, and they really were discovering the virtues of champagne, for one thing. They were bottling the still wine of champagne in their cellars, and by keeping the cork tied down, uh, it became fizzy, and they thought this was something absolutely wonderful. So in that regard, champagne was really being invented in England. And so were a lot of other wines. I mean, port was largely made to the English taste. We'd got this great claret tradition, which was sort of cemented by the grandees who could afford anything they wanted. Um, we were sort of refining the the great traditions, the great styles of wine, and that was a marvelous moment, I'm sure.
Very formative. I agree. It would have been an incredible era to have witnessed. You did just mention corks being pushed down, and Jeff Harding, if you're still on the call, you may know that I'm just going to quickly tell you a little anecdote, Hugh, because Jeff emailed us before the session, and Jeff is obviously a member. And he said, Hugh writes in A Life Uncorked of two ladies coming to lunch and bringing, I think, a Loire white that was battery acid. In my first holiday from university, the hot summer of '76, with growing interest but a student budget and no expertise, I landed a summer job on the sales floor of Harrods wine department, with my main job each morning to push the emerging corks back into the bottles, as the sales floor was above the boiler house. Midway, I sold a bottle of Ackerman Laurence Vouvray to two genteel ladies who were off to lunch with Hugh. I didn't know who he was, and I thought Vouvray a safe bet for all occasions. I returned with a copy of Hugh Johnson's Wine Atlas to university and didn't look back until I had done my MW training course. If appropriate, please relay my apologies to HJ.
I'm glad you're not asking me to name the ladies.
No, don't worry, they can go anonymously. But we have outed the sales gentleman, so Jeff Harding is to blame for the battery acid that you wrote about in A Life Uncorked. A confession that I'm sure you weren't expecting at the beginning of this call.
That's one of my favorite books, actually, because I was able to tell stories like that.
Well, there we go. We've got some missing puzzle pieces as well. So really there, unfortunately, members, does end our evening. I can't thank Hugh enough for spending a most glorious hour with us, and to all of you members as well for spending the hour. I mean, I'm sure it was not a challenge. It has been an absolute privilege, Hugh. I should mention as well that thanks to the republication of The Story of Wine, we've also got a discount code. I'll be sending an email with where to buy the book and the £5 off. And most importantly, for our members, their first buyers will go into a draw, and we've got 25 signed book plates to give away as well. So do be sure, if you want to buy the newest edition, or you haven't got a copy at all, then I hugely encourage you, absolutely get hold of it. And if you use our tastings and events team discount code, then you will go into the draw for the book plates. But Hugh, that really does, what a glorious evening. I'm almost speechless. The wordsmith has removed all of the words from my body, and I've lost the power to speak, because it has been a real pleasure tonight. We hope that you'll continue to share in wines from the Wine Society, and I'm sure our members will continue to follow every word you say and every word you write to the letter, as I know that I do. So a cheers and a good evening, Hugh. Thank you.
Well, it's lovely to spend an evening with people who I feel really are members of the same club as me, which is the Wine Society. So thank you for sharing this time. Your health.
To health. Cheers, Hugh. Thank you.
And thank you, Anna.